that people have these preconceived ideas that, how safe they can feel in a car when there are, shells or shots being fired around them, and how that full sense of security can actually be quite detrimental and harmful.
Welcome back to the World Extreme Medicine podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this conversation, I'm speaking with Scott King on hostile environment awareness training. So what I want to do in the conversation is look at some of the challenges of training and equipping NGOs to live and work in some of the most hostile environments on the planet. So what we're going to examine is some of the high fidelity and indeed low fidelity training which is undertaken to achieve this. We're also going to examine some of the simulation training and realism that's used as an analogue of reality in this environment. And also, finally, we're going to look at the end result of this training and what it does to prepare people for going into hostile environments. So to do this, I have Scott King with me. Scott is a paramedic with over 20 years experience in both clinical operations and indeed emergency management and planning. He teaches on various courses around the world, including PHLS, Battles, CBRNE, and indeed other courses such as ALS courses. He holds a diploma in health emergency planning and has delivered training in the Middle East, Ukraine, and indeed in various continents across the world. Welcome, Scott, to the podcast.
Hi, Owen. Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you, Scott. Just I thought initially, if you could maybe speak to what heat training is and what it indeed seeks to do.
So HEAT is hostile environment awareness training. It can come in all sorts of disguises, really, and depending on who's providing it, it can really have quite a different slant and take on the content. Typically, it would be heavily militarized or by former military staff or security staff who would teach normally a week-long, highly immersive program for candidates, typically maybe media, who are going into which traditionally would have been like military or conflict zones to report. As more and more kind of corporate responsibilities taken on, NGOs are looking at better training and preparing their staff. And there's almost been a branch off to humanitarian training in the HEAT environment. And that's kind of where I've seemed to have just slipped in with my experience, and found myself now delivering quite a lot of HEAT training to civilian, non-military NGO staff.
So as you said, Scott, you're teaching and training non-medical staff in what are kind of highly kinetic, highly dynamic environments. Could you maybe speak to the sort of the trauma skills you're teaching, and indeed maybe how difficult that is to impart on people that maybe don't have any medical backgrounds?
So I started off my career really kind of with an interest in trauma. I was fortunate to grow up in Cornwall, where there was a really prominent figure, paramedic, who was a role model to me, who set up a charity that looked at trauma training and equipment, and that was known as Fleet. And I started off delivering trauma training, which then went on to PHLS in the UK. And then from that, stumbled across the military world. So I'm not a serving military medic, and I was very proud to really kind of be brought on as a civilian to the medical training faculty, which then kind of opened up a whole new area of expertise of military medicine, which as civilian medics, the vast experience that is arose from theatre is huge, and we've learnt a lot, and there's numerous articles now, and it's really directing our civilian practice. What I found is that you need to kind of really understand your topic to simplify it in the best way. So having a lot of time and experience teaching paramedics or those on intercalated degree programs at Cardiff, having that sort of theoretical and practical skill to then really simplify it in a way that non-medics that have had no training whatsoever can understand and be effective. And it really struck home how important that is in December in Ukraine, when the head of mission for an NGO asked me who my best medic was on the course, and there was characteristics of the wannabe paramilitary NGO humanitarian who has got all the gear and all the mole kit, and I actually pointed out that it was the cleaner from Kyiv, a 6-year-old female who ran the office and was the cleaner. And I was like, I'd go to the front line with her as a medic. So she was awesome. She didn't speak any English, which was another barrier. But she accepted what was being told and asked of her, and she just did it. There wasn't any question. And she was able to understand the importance of just doing those simple, basic things and not trying to get ahead of herself or try and look too far or question and really interrogate what was being asked of them. And in the early stages, that's really, really important. You need to kind of be able to impart messages and have a student candidacy that accepts and takes on what you're telling them.
I think, you speak to this, Scott, around how to teach some of the fundamentals of maybe trauma first aid to a non-English speaking population, how you need to deconstruct it and how that needs to look to be well received, understood, and indeed replicated when it matters. Actually, so could you maybe speak to the level of trauma first aid that you teach, and indeed how you make it immersive or indeed impactful?
So the program fundamentally uses kind of a mix of my experiences, which is where I build my strength from. So pre-hospital trauma life support, British Army trauma life support courses. And as we've gone more internationally, we've looked certainly at things like TCCC, which is combat casualty care, and the tech programs, which again is tactical emergency care. And they all have common generic themes that primarily look at the early management and focus upon massive or catastrophic hemorrhage. And it's quite interesting. I'm having a quandary at the moment about should we really be applying March as our primary survey approach and moving away from CABCDE in civilian practice as I'm spending more and more time delivering March. So some of the fundamentals is aggressive management of blood loss, which we have been talking about almost since the Vietnamese War, and still talking about in all the post-conflicts thereafter as the major cause of trauma, loss of life, and the biggest impact that we can have as those first responder medics, regardless of our skill set. And I don't think anybody from your audience will ever be shocked by, the phrases of doing the simple things well and keeping it simple, which is, said time and time again, but questions the fact that it still needs to be said and the importance of driving that home. So we'll look at good tourniquet application use. I'm very interested in obviously low equipment environments, whether that's wilderness or combat, about improvised tourniquets, more so on the dangers of not doing it right. And I think it's very easily talked about the improvisation of kit on a lot of fronts, but certainly in tourniquets is a concern of mine, that if people don't have the understanding of what they're trying to achieve, actually they can worsen blood loss in those instances. Trying to get people to understand that some things are beyond our skill set, even as medics, and there are limitations to what we can do for the non-compressible bleeds. But doing the basic well of good wound packing, whether that's hemostatic agents or non-hemostatic dressings that were being applied, primarily the concept of occupying the space to prevent blood loss and direct pressure is a good key skill that we'll teach. How we would improvise maybe using flutter valves or chest seals is another sort of thing that we would look at driving home. Similarly with catastrophic hemorrhage, we'd look at pelvic control. So real makeshift use of pelvic binders using trousers, belts, and looking at getting normal anatomy as opposed to risking over compression, which can be achieved with some of the devices that are out on the market. But but bring it back to simple things. Just simply pulling ankles together and tying the ankles first will reduce that that pelvic space on its own, and understanding that even for quite severe catastrophic injuries, you know, people feel better when they're doing something. When you're being treated, you have a sense of reassurance and confidence that someone is doing something. Even those simple things will have a big impact. So those are the primary kind of skill sets that we would look at. The next is really how we build upon teaching that in a classroom scenario, to taking it outside the classroom into those more novel environments. And I'm a big key that people that either, you know, English isn't their first language, trying to learn new skills, have to almost overcome, you know, a language barrier, and then there's the medical language barrier as well. So a lot of hands-on is a good way of overcoming those barriers and challenges. So simple skill sets, applying them in the environments that we're likely to come across, going from simple to complex is kind of how I like to build it up, and then fidelity increases with that.
So you speak to fidelity, and I think it's a really interesting point. Like you said, the kinaesthetic learning almost speaks volumes versus head knowledge, and indeed maybe PowerPoint or didactic learning. Could you maybe speak to the fidelity? You know, I'm aware on some of the courses that you run, you use paintball areas whereby it's, you know, put in as an active shooter, and indeed if people get shot, they have to treat that as real and, you know, take care of each other, do the stepwise hemorrhage control on each other, and indeed putting injects into the simulation whereby there is a semblance of realism there. Could you maybe speak to sort of the fidelity, what they get out of the increase in the fidelity into these almost live practice situations?
Yeah, so on the programs that I teach on, predominantly look at a week-long theme. So if we take humanitarianism as an example, we would look at developing a mission that they need to go and achieve, which then practices and puts them in their comfort zone. So an example would be that they would look to develop a water program or a kind of a wash program in an area. And we look at things like mission planning at the very early stages, how they build that, what's important. And we try and get them to then simulate going to access that mission, to maybe look at negotiation of access. And within that, we can incorporate things like checkpoints. And it doesn't have to be the high-end disaster checkpoint that might come later on in the course on sort of day 4 or 5. It can just be the simple kind of the practice of getting your documentations, and the simple things that people that would have travelled abroad and gone through checkpoints will have experienced, you know, making sure that your documentation, that your conduct and how you engage at checkpoints, whether they are official or unofficial or planned or unexpected. And that works towards building up the participants' sort of suspension of disbelief. They then start getting into their role, which means that they're in a good, pliable sort of situation, ready to take on some of the other challenges that are faced and put to them. So we would look at things like contact drills, how they would safely exiting and negotiating hazards and cars. And it's quite interesting when you teach in military zones that you can fire back, and that's the first rule of combat care, is win the firefight, which is interesting for me with no military background, is that I've only ever learned, whether teaching civilian medicine or the police. So when we were talking about checkpoints and not being armed, they have to really rely on basic, simple skills. And there's some interesting footage of the Sky News reporters that were involved in a false flag ambush in Ukraine. And that's certainly some of the best civilian footage at the moment about kind of the risks that are being faced, certainly in Ukraine, but could happen, you know, globally, and how civilians have to respond in those circumstances. And it's very interesting that people have these preconceived ideas that, how safe they can feel in a car when there are, shells or shots being fired around them, and how that full sense of security can actually be quite detrimental and harmful, and the importance of having to take stock of the environment, what's going on, and allow that muscle memory of training to get out the car. So we look at building up that mission planning through to simple to complex. And as we do that, we then build up the fidelity and the expectations of the medicine that they would look to try and deliver. There is a good element of muscle memory and pain memory. If you are shot, you will become better at avoiding being shot, albeit with simulation or paint rounds. But throwing in tourniquet drills at random parts of the day, really trying to hone that self-application process of getting it down to 30 seconds on, 30 seconds to apply compression. By the start of it, you can see where the thumbs are fimbling, and they just can't achieve that. But certainly by the end of the week, those skills are highly honed, even in civilian practice from non-medics. And once they can do it on themselves, they can then apply it to others.
So looking at, you spoke about the non-medical aspects actually, and indeed the adage of conflict resolution and exiting a vehicle. But could you speak to some of the interesting aspects you also put in around sort of the kidnap of participants, and indeed sort of how you approach it, how it remains learning versus just maybe a deeply traumatic experience. But how do you sort of broach the element of maybe kidnap, and indeed maybe more the traumatic sides of what might be working in an NGO field?
I think a lot of the candidates that are coming on the course have heard very mixed stories, some very positive, some distressing and traumatic. And as I started, it very much depends on kind of the organisation that's running the training, their background, their insight, their agenda, as it were, and kind of how right the fix is for who's delivering your training versus what the outcomes are. The expectations and the training put into maybe military participants is going to be completely different to the input that's going to be required of civilian NGO staff. And having worked on both, it's really clear the difference in tone, threats, the duration of the programme, because the realities of what they will face can be quite different. So just focusing in on that humanitarian factor, a lot of the students have coming through potentially could already have been through traumatic experiences, and it's certainly at one point on every course, despite screening students beforehand and setting up things like safe words, which are common practice in any simulation, just trying to get an understanding of where the students are in their own experience. So there are some programs where it's de-emphasized as regards a kidnapping role. In others, it's emphasized just based on kind of the candidateship. And I think that's important and really key to the strength of faculty that you have working on these programs, to be able to read and understand the audience, because it can be quite damaging. And there's normally one person that has been kidnapped. And there's stories of a Nigerian doctor who was kidnapped by Boko Haram, who was held hostage. A lot of his party were unfortunately killed. And then trying to, one, use that as first-hand learning to share with the groups, but equally respecting what is coming and potentially the effects that might have on him as an individual. So it is a high risk but high beneficial kind of important thing to do on the courses. So it certainly comes later on in the program where we've got that understanding of the group dynamics, who we need to focus on, and looking at warning signs that something isn't quite right. even when candidates know that they're coming on a heat course and potentially are expecting it, it always surprises me the skill of the faculty which I sit on to be able to come out with the surprising element, and that shock. And that's the one of the main things is that kind of shock of kidnap, which we will talk about and lecture on, and coping strategies and things to look out for in yourself and your groups, as well as those kidnappers that are engaging with you. So it's an interesting part of the programme on heat, and one that would be a shame to kind of spoil for future participants if we sort of explained all the details of how it's achieved to get that shock. But yeah, we seem to manage it.
So could you speak to the elements of debrief, how you teach debrief, how you get students to debrief, maybe even themselves? What does that look like, and what's maybe the transition of maybe you orchestrating the debrief versus imparting it and getting them to sort of self debrief over the course?
I think in the early days, at the beginning of the course, it's very heavily instructor led. And it's more typical for what your audience are probably expecting with regards like a hot debrief. And certainly ones in the ambulance service or sort of pre-hospital emergency care will be accustomed to in those hot debriefs scenarios of things that have gone well, things that have not gone well. But also picking up those immediate points that should this incident occur as our next incident or tomorrow or next, what do we need to immediately address? As the course progresses, the structure of that hot debrief is able to kind of change to a more reflective, participant-led, as their confidence increases, their exposure increases, and their knowledge increases. So as a faculty, we can then kind of take that step back and we become almost facilitators of the group self-reflection. And typically we'd see then people becoming highly kind of reflective of things that have normally gone awry and things that haven't gone well. And it's just the importance of addressing and milestoning and checking where they are compared to where they started. Because people's expectations suddenly go up massively when they're in these high fidelity scenarios, because to them it becomes very real. And by day 3, when you're throwing in different scenarios that are using either amputees in action type casualties or high fidelity simulating aids, mannequins, or meat to do procedures on, people very much get drawn in and sucked into that task focus, which on human factors courses, we're well accustomed to that, the bandwidth being overloaded and kind of becoming task orientated. And you can really see that go on as we throw more towards the students. So yeah, it's good because you can really see the development in students on these courses, and it's a real rapid positive enforcement for me, certainly as a clinician and as an educator and tutor. It's really positive to see people come in and quickly become drawn into the sort of scenario.
So you've taught, Scott, in some pretty dynamic situations, like you said, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and across North Africa as well. And could you maybe speak to what you see as an end result of this training? How do people come away? Do they feel more equipped? Especially, I think you spoke to earlier about delivering training when there's non-English speakers, but seeing them develop and indeed orchestrate some of these principles, even as a result of not being able to speak the language, must be quite powerful. Could you maybe speak to that?
So I can always remember it was such a powerful time. The first time I taught in a non-native country in a language that I didn't speak, and just that sense of overwhelming, like, what am I doing here? A massive inferiority complex. Definitely felt fraud. That I was right to be here. And as the course settled down, theatrical skills came to play, and I'm jumping and running around a classroom and I'm play acting a lot more than I would normally do in English lectures. But it soon reassured me that I'd got a good slide set. I knew my knowledge was sound in what I needed to impart. The slides were in native language. I didn't need to read the slides because I knew the content for where they were. And my actions corresponded to the slides. And I was fortunate that we had a few broken speaking English that kind of the difficult terms we were able to kind of negotiate. But people tend to not speak medical English. It's colloquial English. So I remember just this sense of fear and dread, looking at these eyes in the classroom, looking at me as if to impart everything that they needed to know to get through the week. But we achieved it, and they did really well. And they were probably one of my best courses, and the outcomes were probably the highest, because things were really had to be honed to basics and to be really succinct and clear in the emphasis of what I was trying to deliver. People come away being surprised at the end scenarios that they face, that they've come out the other end. And so I like to start my courses really getting an idea of what students bring, what they want to achieve, as a mind mapping experience. You know, what is it they're fearful of? What is it they want to achieve? It means you can hone some of those individual learnings to things that you may not have considered that makes it sort of pertinent to them. So things like children drowning, things like that I would never have necessarily thought to include. It's very easy to me include in courses that they get a sense of additional worth and meet their needs as learners. But to then use that to reflect back on at the end of the course and really kind of show their journey. And it's something I'm working on at the moment, that we end on a slide set of photos and videos of kind of to show the progress, to really capitalize kind of what they've gone through as a journey, because a week doesn't sound a long time, but when you are in high stressful environments, that's learning new skill, you know, as you learn something new, something old comes out of your brain. A week is a very long time. It's almost like a week in the Big Brother house, being on a HEAT course. And you can see like friendships, bonds. You know, anyone that's gone through immersive training will tell you that, you know, those non-technical skills are just magnified.
So as we come into land in the conversation, Scott, just a final question really around, if others were listening to this wanting to develop high fidelity simulation or indeed high fidelity training, you know, you've spoken to, you know, you put people through different aspects of the medical injects. So actors, you use training aids such as pieces of meat to do wound packing. You there's high fidelity makeup, there's smoke machines, there's paintball ranges where people actually physically get shot. There's active debriefing. There is a real semblance of reality to this, you know, an element of kidnap and using 4x4s and indigenous actors from the countries. Truly immersive, actually, having been on some of these courses. Could you maybe speak to take-home messages for others wanting to deliver high fidelity training and sort of this immersive training environment?
I think it's very topical. Certainly in UK practice now, simulation has grown hugely over the last decade, and investment is only, I think, going to increase. And you can see that by, you know, the courses that are doing really well at the moment have got good followership. Are courses that really home in on high fidelity, and I think to really do fidelity well, you need a good breadth and depth of facilitators and instructing staff, because it takes a lot of planning and that prior preparation to come up with a scenario. But equally, it's to be truly immersive, it needs to be dynamic. And it needs to be able to respond in real time to the events that play out. Now, typically, as experience develops in any training course or scenario, you learn common ways that people are going to approach things, and you can anticipate those. But there will be things that don't go as planned, and the unexpected will occur. And that's where your faculty really will come into their own, because they can respond in real time to true events, and really make that scenario then evolve and develop with the students. But also from a safety point of view, having that ability to really look at the students, to see how they're responding, to see those non-technical skills, look at when people are becoming overloaded, they're beginning to burn or not cope, because it needs to be safe, physically safe, but it's psychologically safe, and it's about learning. And I'm, not in the business of breaking students, because nobody wins, and people then become disheartened, they don't achieve and they don't perform. And our role as clinical tutors really is about getting the best out of people, and making sure that the people that I'm teaching will exceed my skill set and will become a far better clinician than me. And that's one of the reasons why I'm really looking at going into this more, because we've all got our own personal lives that we have to juggle with work and family. And, I would love to develop more international tours. It's just significant time away. And for me, being able to go away and deliver something in a short period of time, in that time frame, I might sort of treat or, make an impact on maybe a dozen patients in sort of poor conflict zones. Whereas actually, my last tour, we taught 160 people just off one program in, key life-saving skills. And I think actually justification and interest for me is that if they go on, my influence of impact has now just massively increased. So I think having a good faculty, like icebergs, they need to have that hidden depth underneath to really draw upon, is key. And it's a program that I stumbled in, and so I would say, if this is something that you're interested in, is follow it, go with it. And I'm here, not for any plan or career program. I'm here by saying yes. So I think, as a rule of thumb for any program or interest that people have, is say yes and be nice about it.
Scott, that's fantastic. Thank you for the last half an hour. I really appreciate both your perspectives and your insights. And it's been really informative just to get your perspective. So thank you for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the episode. Please feel free to rate, review, and subscribe on whichever platform you're listening to. Please also head over to the World Extreme Medicine website, where you can find more engaging content on extreme medicine webinars, and indeed the collection of courses from our global network, including humanitarian, disaster relief, expedition, space, military, tactical, and performance medicine. Thanks again.